The Bronze Age collapse of the 12th century BCE destroyed the ancient world. The Hittite Empire vanished completely. The Mycenaean civilization collapsed and never recovered. Palaces, cities, and ports across the eastern Mediterranean were burned, abandoned, or erased. Trade networks that had connected the world for centuries disintegrated. Writing disappeared in many regions. Entire cultures entered centuries of silence. Almost everything fell. And yet Egypt survived. Egypt did not avoid the catastrophe. It suffered deeply. It lost power, territory, and wealth, but it did not collapse. That alone already placed Egypt above nearly every neighboring civilization of the time. While the eastern Mediterranean descended into chaos, Egypt remained standing, reduced, weakened, and transformed, but alive. Egypt resisted the attacks of the so-called Sea Peoples. It defended the Nile Valley. It preserved its religious traditions, its temples, and its administrative memory. This survival, however, came at a cost. The Egypt that emerged from the catastrophe was no longer the imperial power of the new kingdom. The world it had dominated no longer existed. The Egypt that survived the Bronze Age collapse was no longer an empire. The new kingdom was over. The age of permanent military expansion ended. The age of monumental construction on an imperial scale ended. Egypt could no longer project power across the eastern Mediterranean. The state began to contract. All territories that did not lie directly along the Nile were lost. Nubia fell away, along with its rich gold mines and stone quarries. The southern regions that had once supplied Egypt with immense wealth were abandoned.
Egypt also lost control of the Levant. Access to Lebanese cedar disappeared. This timber had been essential for shipbuilding, temples, and monumental architecture. Egypt, a land with little native wood, could no longer obtain it easily. Sinai was lost as well. With it went access to copper, another critical resource. Egyptian garrisons were withdrawn. Imperial administration collapsed outside the Nile Valley. For the first time in centuries, Egypt was forced to accept a smaller world. The great imperial capitals of the new kingdom lost their meaning. The vision of Egypt as the ruler of surrounding lands vanished. What remained was the Nile itself. Egypt became a river civilization once again, concentrated inward, focused on survival rather than domination. Despite the loss of empire, Egypt did not collapse internally. The state continued to function. Temples remained open. Rituals continued without interruption. Festivals were still celebrated. The gods were still worshipped. The Nile continued to flood according to its ancient rhythms. To the outside world, Egypt appeared weakened. Inside the Nile Valley, daily life endured. But the structure of power had changed. Egypt was no longer a centralized imperial state, ruled directly by a dominant pharaoh. Authority became fragmented and redistributed. This transformation did not happen through open civil war. It happened quietly. Power slowly shifted away from the royal court and toward the temples, especially the great temple of Amun in Thebes. The pharaohs still existed. Royal titles were still used. Official chronology continued to count years by the reigns of kings. But in practice, decision-making increasingly belonged to religious institutions.
This change is not visible through monumental inscriptions or triumphal reliefs. It becomes clear only when we look at everyday documents. One text in particular captures this new reality with striking clarity. It is known today as the Journey of Wenamun. The Journey of Wenamun reveals what Egypt had become after the collapse. Wenamun was a priest of Amun. He was sent from Thebes to the city of Byblos in modern Lebanon. His task was to obtain cedar wood for construction. In earlier centuries, Egypt did not negotiate for such materials. It demanded them. Now, everything was different. Before Wenamun even reached Byblos, disaster struck. In the city of Dor, his silver was stolen. The funds meant for acquiring cedar were gone.
Wenamun attempted to recover the money by seizing compensation from local authorities. This nearly cost him his life. He was forced to flee. When he finally arrived in Byblos, he expected recognition as a representative of Egypt. Instead, he was treated as an ordinary foreigner. The ruler of Byblos reminded him that even Egypt's greatest pharaohs had paid for cedar. Egypt, he implied, was no longer exceptional. No fear, no automatic obedience, only negotiation. Wenamun eventually secured the cedar through diplomacy and promises rather than power. On his return journey, he was attacked again and forced to stop on Cyprus. The text ends there. We do not know what happened to Wenamun. We do not know if the cedar ever reached Egypt. That silence speaks louder than any conclusion. Formally, Egypt still had pharaohs. Royal names were recorded. Years were counted by royal reigns. The image of kingship was preserved. But real power was no longer concentrated in one place. The Journey of Wenamun makes this clear.
Wenamun does not receive his mission from the pharaoh. He receives it from the high priest of Amun in Thebes. The expedition is not organized by the state. It is organized by the temple. The cedar Wenamun seeks is not for royal palaces. It is for the sanctuary of Amun. The pharaoh exists, but only in the background. Egypt had become a divided system. In the south, Upper Egypt was dominated by the powerful priesthood of Amun. In the north, Lower Egypt fragmented into multiple centers of authority. Despite this division, Egypt did not descend into constant warfare. Instead, different power structures coexisted. Pharaohs ruled in name. Priests ruled in practice. This balance was fragile, but it worked. Egypt survived not because it was unified, but because its institutions adapted. At the same time, the Nile Delta was changing. Groups from the west began to settle there. In Egyptian sources, they are usually called Libyans. These were not temporary raiders. They settled permanently. Local cities and regions increasingly fell under the control of foreign military chiefs. Many of them had non-Egyptian names. They ruled specific towns, districts, and territories. Yet these rulers did not reject Egyptian culture. They adopted it. They worshipped Egyptian gods. They honored Amun. They followed Egyptian religious rituals. Most importantly, they supported the temples. Libyan chiefs frequently issued donation stelae. On these monuments, they formally gifted land to local gods and temples. In reality, the land was handed over to temple administrations. Priests celebrated these donations. They blessed the rulers. They recognized them as legitimate. This was not forced conversion. It was political adaptation.
By supporting Ma'at, the cosmic order, foreign rulers became part of the Egyptian system. Egypt was no longer ruled only by Egyptians, but Egypt was still ruled in an Egyptian way. Despite political fragmentation, Egyptian civilization continued to function. Economic life did not collapse. Agriculture remained stable. The Nile continued to flood reliably. Harvests were sufficient. In some regions, productivity even increased. Areas of the Western Delta that had once been marginal for traditional farming became useful under new pastoral economies. Libyan settlers introduced large-scale herding of sheep and goats. This strengthened local production and trade. Temples remained the central economic institutions of the country. They controlled land. They managed labor. They stored grain. They redistributed resources. Religious life also continued without interruption. The cult of the Apis bull survived. Priests still traveled across Egypt searching for the calf marked by the signs of the god. The chosen bull was brought to the temple, honored as a living deity, and cared for throughout its life. When the bull died, it was mummified with great ceremony. For the Egyptians, this was proof that the gods had not abandoned them. As long as the gods continued to manifest themselves in the world, Egypt believed it was still worthy. Ma'at still existed. Order had not been broken. This period created a form of power Egypt had never known before. There was no single center. Multiple dynasties ruled at the same time. Local military leaders proclaimed themselves pharaohs.
Each claimed the full royal titulary. Each called himself ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt. In reality, none of them controlled the whole country. Royal authority became symbolic.
This shift is visible in the material record. Ancient monuments were dismantled and reused. Statues from earlier periods were recarved with new royal names. Stelae were erased and reinscribed. Building new monuments was no longer possible on a grand scale. Instead, Egypt reused its own past. Even royal burials were affected. The Valley of the Kings could no longer be protected. Tombs were robbed repeatedly. The priesthood of Amun responded by organizing a massive relocation of royal mummies. Kings were removed from their original tombs and hidden in secret caches. Funerary equipment was stripped and reused. This was not neglect. It was an emergency measure. Egypt was doing everything it could to preserve what remained. South of Egypt, beyond the first cataract of the Nile, a different process was unfolding. Nubia did not collapse after the end of the New Kingdom. Egyptian administration remained there. Temples continued to function. Writing, religious practice, and state organization survived. What had once been a provincial extension of Egypt began to develop independently. Over time, Nubia absorbed Egyptian culture even more thoroughly than Egypt itself. Nubian elites worshipped Amun. They built temples in Egyptian style. They used Egyptian writing. They followed Egyptian ritual law. From their perspective, they preserved what Egypt had begun to abandon. The sacred center of this world was Napata, near Jebel Barkal. There stood a major temple of Amun, served by a powerful priesthood. For Nubian rulers, Egypt was no longer the unquestioned center of order. Egypt had fractured, its authority was divided, its traditions were diluted. From the south, it appeared that Ma'at in Egypt had been compromised.
In the 8th century BCE, Nubian rulers moved north. They did not present themselves as conquerors. They presented themselves as restorers. They claimed that Egypt had abandoned Ma'at, that temples had lost discipline, that kings no longer ruled according to divine order. From their perspective, intervention was necessary. The Nubian king Paye advanced into Egypt and defeated local rulers one by one. Cities surrendered, local kings submitted. Paye recorded his campaign in detail. He described Egypt as fragmented, corrupt, and morally weakened. One detail stands out. Paye condemned Egyptian rulers not only for political failures, but for religious neglect. He accused them of improper ritual behavior. He even condemned the mistreatment of horses in royal stables. For Paye, this was proof that Egypt had lost its sense of order. After his victory, he did not destroy Egyptian institutions. He reinforced them. Temples were restored. Rituals were renewed. Priests of Amun were elevated. Nubian rule was presented as the return of proper kingship. Under Nubian rule, Egypt entered a period of restoration. This era is known as the 25th dynasty. The new rulers deliberately looked backward, not to the recent past, but to Egypt's deepest traditions. They revived ancient artistic canons. They restored temple construction. They renewed long-forgotten rituals. Pyramids were built again. Sacred texts were copied from older sources. Even the language of inscriptions reflected earlier periods of Egyptian history. For the Nubian kings, legitimacy came from continuity. They ruled Egypt not as outsiders, but as guardians of an ancient order. Gold from Nubia flowed north. Stone quarries were reopened. Monumental building resumed.
For a time, Egypt once again appeared whole. But it was no longer an empire of expansion. It was a civilization focused on preservation. Egypt had survived the Bronze Age collapse, not by resisting change, but by absorbing it. It survived because its religion adapted, because its institutions transformed, because its idea of order was flexible enough to endure. Empires fell, systems fractured, but Egypt continued. Not unchanged, not undefeated, but alive.